Across the last 3 years, Centria has been on a mission to fundamentally transform the model of care for our clients, our staff, and the industry.
We will share with you our journey towards assent-based care, the lessons we've learned, and the people we've learned them with.
We're your hosts, Timothy Yeager
and Hillary Laney.
Welcome to the HRE Podcast.
All right.
Jerry,
welcome.
Thank you.
I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
So am I.
Happy to be here.
Always love talking with Jerry.
Yeah. So just tell us a little about yourself. Who you are, what you're doing at Centria, how long you've been doing it.
Yeah. So I have grown up in the Metro Detroit area, was born in India. Parents came here in 91. So almost born and raised here. Got into the field of ABA in 2015 after a long educational career of not knowing what to do, feeling like a failure, just because I never connected or had a passion for education or for learning until I was a technician. And I think a combination of knowing I could help a child find joy in working in an educational setting, in addition to having supervisors, who motivated me to, hey, there's like a science behind this. And so those were kind of the two things that drove me to explore the field further. Grad school, was a BCBA for a few years in the Metro Detroit area before coming to Centria, but came to Centria because of just seeking a provider and an employer that would further align with my values. And so the PFA and SPT process and interviewing with you kind of pulled me in, and you sold Centria, you sold the mission. And so for the last over a year, been at the center in Dearborn, was able to transition into a CLR role, clinical leadership resident, to help with our Foundations of Care rollout. And so now I'm between Dearborn and Grand Rapids, and just looking to do more as we go for the state of Michigan and the services we provide for our clients.
And
our role.
Next area director of clinical services.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm so proud of you,
So
man.
proud.
I'm very excited, and it's having mentors and support people like you got me to the place I am, and happy to stay connected with you guys and keep pushing our mission further.
I was just reflecting. I think it was a conversation we had recently. I can remember, Jerry and Batul applied to be on your team initially.
Yep.
And while I think at that time we didn't think that you were ready for that role, I'm like, you are a person that we need to have in our company.
Yep.
While this role may be not the right role for you now, you're a future leader in our company, and I would not be successful as a leader of this company if I could not attract you to work for us
and find a place for you.
And find a place for you. The honest part of this conversation is I laid out a vision and a promise that I don't necessarily think I fully believed could happen.
Didn't know how to deliver on.
Right? And yet every single thing we talked about has happened.
Yeah.
It's pretty crazy.
We said focus on Dearborn, get Dearborn to a place,
right,
and then we can go across Michigan.
Yeah.
Right? And so your CLR role, you're in Grand Rapids area, right? So you're moving outside of Michigan. And then this area director of clinical services role is that. You are going to be responsible for
the west side of the state.
Large swath of the mitten.
Yeah. And there's definitely times where, it was hard to stay just bought in general, right? It's a big company. There's a lot of changes happening. There's a lot of focus on the business side of things in addition to the clinical side of things. So, looking back, I am as with just different points in anybody's life where you're like, man, I wish it would have gone differently. And so as much as I would have thought, or as much as I thought that, man, I wish I could have been hired into a director position. Looking back, that, coming into Dearborn and the progression and the skills that I learned along the way, I wouldn't have been ready for a role like the area clinical director if I hadn't been in the positions and gotten the experiences I have over the last year. And I think what's important to me, I think now, especially progressing in Centria, is that I'm able to be a leader on a local level, and I can see people, see technicians, be on the floor. And I think like that is an important lesson I learned in Dearborn, being there every day, 40, sometimes more than 40 hours a week. And I think those are like necessary components to be able to carry out a plan, like we had.
Yeah. I did tell you, though, you could be on my team now. You've really demonstrated such growth and leadership and a depth of understanding clinically, as well as professionalism. I've watched you navigate so many difficult situations, and we've walked a lot of those things together. And you're just an incredible team member. And so you would be on my team now if that was the opening you had applied for. But Michigan's so lucky to have you. We're lucky to have you.
So there's a lot of things we're going to jump into, but let's like pull back a bit. And like, what's your HRE?
My HRE, probably like I have different contexts of HRE. Yeah. I would say my like go-to is some type of beverage, sitting like on a patio, being in the sun, and just winding down. Another one would probably be, I like mountain biking, which I haven't gotten to take advantage of a lot this summer, but just being on my bike in the trails, doesn't matter where it is. So those are probably a couple of different contexts. And then really just being around my family, my friends, or my girlfriend, and just hanging out, being around people. Those are probably my.
It's funny you started with the like calm, relaxing one, because whenever I see photos of you on Instagram,
I know
it's like a beverage and bright lights and loud music and you dancing.
Festival.
I know.
Traveling.
I didn't even mention the music. I go to quite a few festivals.
Yeah.
But which is like great. I like looking forward to those things, and I like being there. But I couldn't do that like every single day. I couldn't consistently be HRE, just having my ears blown out.
One thing I would like to talk about is the journey to Centria. Mm-hmm. I think that there's a lot of things that BCBAs could learn from you. We live in a culture right now where it's like, what can people do for me?
Right.
Like, what can the company do for me? But like your journey here was like you like taking it upon yourself to like learn what you wanted to learn, to reach out to the people you wanted to reach out to, and like create. Like, you created a development path for yourself. Like, how'd that start?
Yeah. I think fortunately it started in grad school with like being able to like, the state of Michigan like sponsored Dr. Hanley to come do a talk. And I think being exposed to like the progressiveness of the science that we practice so early on in my educational career in ABA, like was the reason that like kind of like lit a fire in me to like be like, okay, if this is in the research and if it's, proven as effective and it's safer for our clients, then from that point on, every provider I went to, every clinician I met, I was like rigid in my thought of like, why aren't you open to this? And, why aren't you doing this? And so like, of course it wasn't, I could have just like been someone who like complained or tried to advocate, which I did, but I knew that like for myself, like I couldn't just, I couldn't like expect someone to build that for me or to create that path for me, because I think I contacted early on like how difficult it would be. And I understand the variables that would make a provider or, ABA providers, the barriers in order to do that. And so I was just like, okay, after work, I'm watching CEU videos. I'm going to use all my CEU budget for the things that I do want to learn. So there were still ways where I could take advantage of my employer, to get those additional learning experiences. And then it was really about really a grassroots movement, at providers that you're at before. And I'm sure a lot of BCBAs can relate to that, whether that's for universal protocols or foundations of care, or PFA SBT stuff. And so,
or peak.
Yeah, or peak. And so there was like a lot of different aspects of like the science in which I was like, there's a progressiveness to it. And a part of it, which I still carry today to me, is like, I think we're effective, but like, to be honest, the field of ABA hasn't fully won me over as being the most effective. Whether that's like Centria, in which like we're doing something so progressive, and you mentioned in your talk earlier, there's not data to really show like this is what clinical quality is, and this is actually what it means for autistic individuals. And so I keep that with me, and I let that kind of like sit with me as I like move through, and I think those help me kind of create a motivation and a passion for it. And I think that is why, I think if enough people do that in enough different places, like a provider or a large company can't turn their eye to it, and they have to look into it at least a little bit.
So what would you tell someone who is either, I think there's kind of two ends of the spectrum here that I see often in our field right now. Someone who is attempting to be progressive and don't quite know how to in their current context, or someone who is fine where they're at right now and the field is moving forward. Like, what would you say to either, like, option A, option B? What would you say to them to inspire them or to help them on their journey as a BCBA, to help them be more engaged with the field, to be coming along with us, or helping their agencies come along with them?
Yeah, I think probably a couple different directions you could take with that. One is like, if you're a BCBA at any employer, the way I've always thought of it is like there's going to be certain expectations of you. Of course, those expectations shouldn't be pushed on you to the point where you're sacrificing your mental health, or time with your family. And so like while you are keeping those things first, I think they're like, for me personally, like there was still a meaningfulness to like, hey, let me at least put myself in a position to meet whatever expectations are expected of me. And so like I have that responsibility, and that carries through and translates to my clients too. So, if when I was a BCBA and I had a full caseload, I knew I had to keep up with those metrics and get myself to a place where I could do that without sacrificing my mental health. And so like for me personally, that took like, just for my own personal journey, like I, was in therapy for my anxiety, and I did that for 2 years. And so I needed to arrange the supports that I needed to like meet any expectation I was supposed to. And then that helped me to like put in extra time to learn all of the extra things that I wanted to, or put myself in a position to help mentor or coach somebody within the company because the company, at large wasn't able to provide that. And so for me personally, you kind of like had to delay where you wanted to be a little bit of like, hey, I know I want to implement this with my clients, or I know I really want to learn this, but I also do need to take the time to like just be able to do the responsibilities that I have to right now.
Yeah.
So
take care of yourself.
Yeah, take care of myself, and then be able to, work effectively having taken care of myself. And for me, I think that made it easier to then pursue everything else that I wanted to, rather than try to pursue it and stay upset about my employer not, owing me something, or whatnot. And so that's just kind of like my view on it and kind of how I approached it over the last few years in the field.
So before you came here, you were working at an agency where you were really leaning into more progressive practices, and in some cases your employer was as well, but in other cases it wasn't always fully there. From the top and the bottom all together and cohesive. And I think that's like a pretty common experience for people across the field. Like, we are talking about the foundations of care quite frequently, but that's the case with, we talked about PEAK, which I know is another area of interest for you. PEAK or EFL or any of these really like beautiful new, but
right.
effective
tools.
Yeah, tools that
Yeah.
the science is moving towards. And so, and not everyone has the opportunity to work at a place, thankfully, like Centria or other places as well that do lean in that way. And so
They can, because we are hiring across 14 states.
there you go. They can hide if they live in a state we serve. But given your experience there and like your continued commitment to growth, like what would you say to that BCBA or that clinician in the field right now who's struggling upstream a little bit?
Yeah. Don't give up. You're going to continue going through a lot of like questioning yourself, and because of the way supervisors or whatever social setting you're in view you, or like you're gonna kind of be gaslit like throughout the entire time. So I think on one end, just be aware of it, and do what you need to in terms of like getting your headspace and your mental health right to be able to handle those situations, but also have a community that you can lean on that you can grow with that share the same values as you. And I think like sometimes it's easy to get yourself isolated
Yeah.
because you're, facing so much pressure and you're kind of like, going upstream so much, you end up feeling like the only one that's like paddling the raft. Right. And so I think it's like, take a second, be aware of that, but then try to build whatever community you can. Because I think as much as you can take the opportunity to do it by yourself, I don't think you should, because that on one end misses out on an opportunity for you yourself to have support. But then I like to think of it as like, that's also a learning opportunity that you're providing to somebody else. So even if you don't have somebody else fully bought in right off the bat, like start making those connections and start, planting those seeds so that they might be a little bit interested. And then on the second end, like if you're a clinician practicing day to day, you still do have, a clinical responsibility to your clients. And I think if you can get some support or some mentorship to do something, I think with the amount of resources that are available now, I think the turnaround to being effective is shorter than it was like maybe 4 or 5 years ago, right?
Agreed.
Like I can remember a lot of failures with, I like right out of that, the first PFA talk, I went to my practicums, or, me and Batul went to our practicum supervisor and we were like, this would be really good for our client, in which we were like having all these troubles with like extinction bursts and really high intensity and dangerous behaviors. Fortunately, she was like, yeah, let's try it out. So I think it's just about, be aware of the pressure you're facing, and as best as possible, find some support and don't let it kind of quiet you down. Even if it's like a small step, take that small step.
Yeah. That's great.
I've been
advice.
thinking about this too. I'm going to answer your question as well.
Okay.
I think that there's two parts. And I read this book and I recommend it to anyone. It's called Designing Your Work Life. And it's ultimately like, most people have a lot more control over their job and can arrange a lot more contingencies into their job than they do. And so a lot of my advice is around like, one, you need to know what your job is, right? Like, I think a lot of people prescribe onto their job, like what the idealistic view of their job is, or what they want their job to be. And if you're not aligned with the company you're working for, that's going to be a constant battle.
Yeah.
Right. And so first and foremost, know what your job is and do that job well. And then arrange times for you to do the things that like you want to do and that add value to your life, to your job, and like more enjoyment. Right.
Yeah.
And so like, for example, like all the work that you've done outside of like your job, if you weren't doing your job well, you wouldn't have gotten those opportunities.
Right.
And it's a very difficult position for people to be in. It's like, oh, I want to implement this or do that, or I want to have this training or do like whatever it may be.
Ideas are sexy.
Ideas are sexy. And yet like what you really need to do is at least provide supervision to your clients.
Do your baseline
right?
job.
And like you have to do that job well. You can't
With
say
the
you believe
impact.
with the impact, right? And I think there's been many times in my professional career where like I didn't fully understand what my job was. I thought I knew what I wanted my job to be, but I didn't do my job that had well, right? And that's a very difficult position to be in for a lot of people. And I think about that around like clinical directors. Like when many clinical directors out there, like they see their center, they have some ideas, but like what is it that your job defines you to do and needs you to do?
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that summarizes like perfectly in terms of like what I tried to do. Like I wasn't like the number one BCBA in terms of like metrics, but like I wasn't being like, I didn't have a microscope on me because I wasn't meeting other responsibilities. Because like on one end, I understand like, from a clinician standpoint, you just might be like so angry at your employer or a supervisor because like you're having pressure to meet all these areas. But like, I learned really quickly, like that's not the way I was going to change my supervisor's behavior or my employer's behavior. Like I have to understand what their values are, even if that doesn't match my values. I'm not going to sacrifice like a really large value of mine just to meet their value. I'm going to keep that in mind. But I think there's like, that also brings personal growth. Like, and I think that makes you more attuned to like your environment and the people that are around. And so if you can, and that's how you build trust. It's like, you don't have to think of it as like, I have to fake it or trick them into thinking I'm bought into something. It's just like, if you can try to do what they are expecting of you, and it's reasonable, then that's going to open more doors for you. Like even in like getting to leadership positions in previous providers, like I wouldn't have been able to do that unless I was trying to align myself with their mission, even if I wasn't fully like, yeah, this company perfectly aligns with my values.
You're not getting the area director. You're getting the area director role. I'm sorry, that was the weird conversation.
Sorry, Jerry.
Gotcha.
Punks.
Yeah. No, you're getting the area director. You got the area director role because you leaned in to like all aspects of your job. And I know that
Even the not fun ones.
I know that there were things that you had to do and had to be effective in that were not the things that like you came here for.
Yeah.
Right?
And you had to grow to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. Yeah, I am not the same person professionally or personally, or, in my personal life that I was a year ago. And that's a good thing, even if it was a lot of hard and difficult experiences, or if like you, Timothy, and you asked me to do something and like, there was plenty of times where I was just like, oh my God, like the fact that I have to do this, but,
Yeah.
While keeping the bigger vision in mind, I think like it's like, you've talked about it before, like Adam Grant, like you got to rethink it or like think it again.
Yeah.
Like every single bad thing that can happen to you can have a good thing. Like whether, and I think about that with like my own,
Everything's a gift.
Everything's a gift. Like
Yeah.
Learning
the
that
trauma
is
you
there.
go through, the anxiety that you face. Like I like to think of it as like, I'm like a really overly anxious person. A quiet person unless you really get to know me, but I can start thinking of that as like, I'd rather be that than like this, like, I don't know, like an egomaniac or coming
Right.
off like I'm not humble. And so like, those are aspects of like, where I think you can translate that to certain experiences of like, yeah, this is going to be uncomfortable and this is going to suck. But what if it does lead to growth in any one of these areas?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like on the flip side of that too is, organizationally we're going through so many changes, and in the same way we're saying like, do your base job, meet your values of your company where they're at. There's people who are maybe not trying to do that with us right now, and it's challenging. And you've
Yeah.
experienced a lot of that, of trying to shift people's mindset, paradigm shift into the foundations of care, into this more values-based, assent-based care model. There's been people who've really struggled with that. And as a leader, can you talk to us about what that's been like and the experiences you've had, and what the struggle is, and how you've kind of worked through that with the
Yeah.
people you've led across not just Dearborn, but you've also gone into the other side of the state with a bunch of clinicians you didn't know
Yeah.
to train them as well. So what was that like?
It wasn't easy. I definitely welcomed the challenge. I will say though, for a majority of like both environments in Dearborn or Grand Rapids, there was a good amount of buy-in. At least that was presented to me. And so for like the specific challenging situations or specific staff members that might have been more challenging, I think it's about, while we have timelines and deadlines and expectations, like you can't let that fully like govern the way you're going to go about like shaping someone's behavior.
Yep.
To be more aligned with it. And I think like, I was able to have open communication with Aaron and with you and with, whether that's clinicians we identify at risk or technicians at risk. I think it's about making sure you don't let what your own personal mission is for a certain project like fully govern the way you're going to shape a clinician's behavior. And so like on one end, the first thing I did was like, no, like I need to take time with this. Especially going into a new group of clinicians, like I need them to trust me. I need them to like me. And it's not, I'm not going to go in there and, push all of these recommendations or insights without having gained their trust. But I think like being someone who has been able to practice foundations of care also allowed me to go in and use a few simple strategies to gain their trust, because ultimately like these tools are effective and they work and they translate across a large number of clients with the individualization per client. So I think that having that skill set in and of itself helped me to build trust, to be on the floor, to be hands-on with technicians and clients.
And show it off, show people that it works,
right,
to get their buy-in.
And so I think like I had to like make sure I wasn't doing too much of even in a leadership position, like you're sometimes leading through people. in this role, like I knew I had to go on and like model and be hands-on and work with the client and work with the technician. And so I think that was a large part of why I think I was able to be successful in like gaining people's trust and gaining their rapport. And I think like, you know, there's always going to be clinicians who will have a lot more to say than the others. And I think like there's a fine line between like not contriving a situation where it's like you're just having someone complain and vent. But I think it's important to allow some of that.
Yeah.
You know, in doses, but I like to think of those as like, how can we end this conversation in an actionable way? You know, can I
great.
talk to one of your other leaders? Can I circle back with you on a certain area that you have an issue with? And so that's like another area that I kept in mind, you know, as those situations arose too.
Yeah. You talked about some simple tools. What are they? The simple tools that you think are effective to teach people?
One, in terms of like when working with a client, I think like I tried, and I think we tried to place such a heavy emphasis on like precursor levels of behavior. And I think after you work with someone for so long and you get into these like really triggering situations, you know, sometimes you don't even know there's precursor behaviors there. And so I think like being able to identify or even explain to somebody, like think of it as their body language, right? Like if this behavior is communication, then there might have been other signals and signs that we missed out on. And so that's something that I think like worked really well across a lot of clients, especially that had like high intensity and dangerous behaviors in their repertoire. And what's another area? And then I think knowing like a leader can come in and not sit back and just coach and talk. Mm-hmm. I think that's another skill, like as a leader, to just like stay hands-on with, is like always do something to be on the floor and to be hands-on and to be able to show, you know. And so like not putting yourself in a position where you're just like learning all these things and then just like you start to teach it without kind of being hands-on with it. And so I think like the progression of this role, the clinical leadership role in and of itself did a good job of keeping that in consideration and allowing people to go from having a caseload and implementing these things to teaching people how to do it, but then they're also able to jump in and help do that.
That's great. Yes. We did it. Jinx.
It's that, and this I think is an important aspect for anyone as a leader, is there's this transition from rule-governed behavior to contingency-shaped behavior, and like an effective leader has to continually be like learning and shaped by the contingencies in the environment.
Right.
And too often leaders don't get into the actual environments that they need to lead people in. Yeah. Right. And so I'm really glad that you pointed that out. Let's take a step back. You came here for PFA and SBT and the vision. The foundational plan wasn't part of that conversation initially.
Yeah. Wasn't even invented
yet at that point. Can you talk to us about just like your view on the impact of the foundational plan and like what that's meant for like your ability to lead, but also maybe clinicians' ability to practice?
Yeah, definitely. So when I came here for like the PFA SBT initiative, like I was also at that time in the beginning stages of like learning what universal protocols really was, like largely. I mean, I think we were using some of those tools before of like, hey, if there's a learning opportunity that's going to evoke a high intensity or dangerous behavior, we're not pushing that. We're, you know, backing off. Like, so I remember a lot of conversations where I would like argue with supervisors of like, why is it more productive to spend 30 minutes collecting frequency behavior data than to back off and then just try again with something different, right? Even as a simple contingency like that. And so like coming in,
we have to win.
We have to win.
Apparently,
yeah. It's all about power and control.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, and then like those frequency counts are apparently added into learning opportunity totals, and that might be more meaningful to somebody than others too. So
that's sad.
So coming into here, I wasn't like, I had a really good opportunity to learn that, you know, from you, Hillary, is like how to use universal protocols or foundations of care before even initiating a PFA and going into SBT. And so I think like when we first started in Dearborn, I only had like one client in SBT. And even if I had other clients on my caseload that were engaging in high intensity and dangerous behaviors, it wasn't necessarily that they needed to like have such a focused SBT process to systematically build their communication and tolerance. It was just more like, hey, we need to know how better to work with this individual. And we need to know how to read their behavior and see their body language. And so that was really meaningful for me to contact coming in and having a caseload and seeing that plan just go to work in and of itself. And I think those are like that the foundations of care treatment package, like without considering PFA and SBT, I think is like everyone should be starting there.
Agreed.
And so when now we know, like whenever someone's like, hey, I think I need to do a functional analysis or go into SBT, like the first thing we can look at is like, okay, what does their day look like? At a baseline, how are we interacting with this child or this client? And I think for a clinician, like I was just speaking with this to a group of clinicians, like I think it was Kaylin's clinicians in Texas or her home team. And I was like, when I had that caseload and like when I finally had a technician fully like implementing my foundational plan with fidelity, there was like so much less burden and stress on me for me to like step away from that client, even if they were a challenging client, because I knew my technician wasn't going to do anything, you know, especially purposefully, that would evoke a high intensity behavior. And then I knew like even if something accidentally happened, like a peer came in or an unplanned EO occurred, I knew that I had more confidence that I didn't need to be pulled away or called,
that
or
they
that,
could handle
you know, yeah, right. Or some big situation for where an incident report and injuries and things were going to happen. So that in and of itself, I think is very, very valuable. And one of the very first things I try to tell clinicians who might see creating a foundational plan and foundations of care plans for their clients as like a lot of work of like, it's a little bit more work on the front end, but it's a very good payoff.
Yeah.
Not only like first and foremost for your client and for them to be in a safe environment, but also for you as a clinician to be effective. And I'm sure you guys hear it too of like clinicians get pulled away for a lot of different things day to day. And I think a foundational plan is the first line of defense
That
to
would
not
have been
let
cool
that happen.
data.
What? How much less they get pulled away?
Yeah, that would have been cool.
Yeah.
A data point.
This is literally what you talk about too, Timothy, is the synthesized reinforcement as the tool, the baseline tool that anyone can use that just creates such a level of safety and surety.
And space.
To figure
Yeah.
things out. Like, you know, if you have a really intense client and your technician isn't going to see you till tomorrow, or you can't make it, they at least have that until the next time they can see you, right? And they can analyze it. They can help you analyze in that situation versus trying to continue to work through these difficult moments in my not humble opinion, no reason. Work through it for no reason, for no payout, for no skills are being learned. Nothing is happening there that's worth the time being spent managing those situations. Just go to synthesized reinforcement.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think like the power of a synthesized reinforcement context to me is like, I don't know, it's just like mind blowing thinking about it sometimes, because we'll have like unsuccessful PFAs.
Yes, it's so amazing.
A child is in HRE and then all of a sudden they've tolerated
20 minutes.
Yeah.
of really challenging things.
For an hour.
And they never have before because
Yeah.
they were never in a synthesized reinforcement. So like the power that all of a sudden you have skills of communication and tolerance coming out of just because you have enriched the environment.
Yep.
That in of itself is so cool.
For the BCBA out there who doesn't know about this, what's synthesized reinforcement?
Synthesized reinforcement is putting together a multitude of reinforcers, not just one. So instead of thinking about my client would like to work for the iPad, they want to work, I hate that phrase, but maybe they're motivated to access the iPad alone, but they probably have a higher MO or they're more motivated to access the iPad in a beanbag chair with headphones and away from their peers and the full attention of an adult, mom not on the cell phone, some snacks nearby, right? All of those things combined is going to create a much more powerful contingency that we can leverage, of course, but also is a great baseline space for them to be in if they're having a hard day or we need to reset expectations. And a distinction I think we need to continually make is that synthesized reinforcement is not the same as hyperrelaxed and engaged. Synthesized reinforcement is the components that create a package that could facilitate HRE, right? I tell people all the time when I'm onboarding them here at Centria, like I take my kids places a lot of times, and we went to Disneyland and Universal Studios this year. Lucky children. And I asked them, I was like, do you think my kids at Disneyland were happy, relaxed, and engaged the entire time? And the answer is absolutely not. There were moments that were just absolutely horrifically awful for them and for me.
Yeah.
But all the components were there, right? So like mom and dad aren't saying no to things. They have access to rides. We got fast passes, so we didn't have to wait in the lines. They had strollers. They didn't have to walk. They had unlimited sugar, unlimited attention from mom and dad. Like the EOs were minimized as much as possible, and the access to reinforcement was maximized as much as possible. Didn't mean they were happy, relaxed, and engaged the whole time, right? And so I think it's an important distinction for us to make that HRE and SR are not the same thing, but you need SR facilitates HRE.
It's like if Jerry was going to festivals nonstop. At some point, that would not be it.
Not would be it.
At some point, I'd be deaf.
And tired. So there's a number of Dearborn questions I have, but one thing I just want to move through this synthesized reinforcement conversation. I think it's an important element, which is the majority of pushback you get from SBT is that it's all about just life in HRE or just SR is always available to you and they're not going to do anything.
Yeah.
What do you say to BCBAs who push back?
I say on one end, it's change your perspective a little bit. Just because we had certain expectations placed on us and we don't have I don't have a disability, I don't have a diagnosis of autism, and I had certain expectations pushed on me, but just because I did and I had to meet certain expectations and standards doesn't mean that that's now that's a societal norm. We should be more flexible in the way we think about what we're providing children, especially children with autism, the expectations we place on what they should be doing or shouldn't be doing. I think there's a perspective change to that. And then on the other end, there's still boundaries.
Yes.
There's still rules. There's still things in the environment that we just cannot systematically shape tolerance to.
I'm clapping. I just love that you brought that up. It's such a passion of mine. I was just thinking as you were talking, there's a client that I've consulted you with for quite a while now. And for 4 months straight, the only intervention package we did was synthesized reinforcement and boundaries.
Yeah.
That was the entire package. And it was an intervention. It was an effective intervention. And that client's now doing SBT and is doing great. But for 4 months, we had to help everyone reframe synthesized reinforcement is the intervention for this client. And I don't want to talk too much more about it because it's not my case. I've just done a lot of consultation with you. But do you want to expand on that at all about what the impact was there or why that was a good intervention for him?
Yeah, I think that was a good intervention for this client because they had, a whole history of learning in which there may have been components of synthesized reinforcement, but there was never an individual in that person's life who could safely hold and manage a boundary or teach a set of rules to make sure that he was safe and that he was provided for. And so when I think of STEAM, of how we set a boundary and what we're saying and what we're doing throughout that moment, I think him being exposed to that was in and of itself a learning opportunity for him to start then building that bridge of trusting an adult. And so I think that's why it was effective, because even though there was times in his life where we're okay, give him what he wants to eat, don't ask him to do anything, let him go where he wants to go. It was kind of there needed to be boundaries there, because for a child, there's at the end of the day, they're still a child, and they don't always know what's best for them.
Yeah.
And there is a way to tell them what is best for them. We're not going to be mean about it. We might be firm about it, but we can still have compassion in it. And so I think for him, that has been the biggest part. And I know on the family's end, building that skill and confidently setting a boundary or telling him about a rule has been a really big change in terms of hey, I feel more comfortable with having this child in my house.
Yep.
And he feels more comfortable with in building a trusting relationship with the adults around him.
Can I just jump in real quick?
Yeah.
It's I thought I've never really had, and so I'm
Go
also going to be a little bit vulnerable and maybe sound stupid, but we'll see. The distinction that you made around SR is not HRE. SR is the package that could generate or could create HRE. There then implies that there's some behavior of the individual that has to occur to engage with those reinforcement contingencies to achieve HRE.
Yeah.
And I guess I've never thought about it in that way, but I also think that is a learning that needs to occur for many of our clients who could be present within all of their reinforcement contingencies and not engage in the right behaviors
Correct.
to get to HRE.
And some of that is because every single thing in their entire life has always been a contingency, right? So we might make the iPad available, we might make all these things available, but they have been conditioned that they have to do something first then. And so for some of our clients, their HRE is actually contingency access, right? Like it's not SR, because SR is too unlimited, it's too unpredictable, and so we have to shape them to teach them that it's okay to access without a contingency. That is, to me, one of the saddest situations to come across.
Yeah.
With that, one distinction I also want to make is that with boundaries, the reason why I think the discussion around synthesized reinforcement is as equally important for a client who is we're really only working on boundaries, is that when you set a boundary and you have to hold a boundary, you need a competing context for them to go to instead of the boundary. So if they want to go outside and run in the street, and you can't let them run outside into the street, there needs to be something to compete with that. It might not compete 100% in equality, but there needs to be an alternative behavior or set of behaviors to engage in. And so if we limit synthesized reinforcement, when we're holding those boundaries, we're limiting our client's ability to become fluent and flexible in the skills they engage in the alternative of the boundary. And so the synthesized reinforcement is, I think, as important as the components of setting a boundary, because you need to have that alternative access point for someone to go to when they can't access the thing they're asking for, or they can't go out or get the thing they wanted. When you're doing access
that is a skill
extinction.
that needs to generalize, right? Which
Yes.
is at some point, if you do myself, the thing that I want to do is not available. What are the things that
I can do? Yeah, what's available instead.
Yeah.
And what we don't want to do is engage in behaviors that are destructive to ourselves or others, right? Adults do this.
Yep.
A lot of us are in therapy for these behaviors. Yeah. They're just not as apparent necessarily to the wide world. And so for our clients, instead of engaging in those behaviors that are destructive or injurious to others or themselves, we want to teach them those that array. It's not one skill, it's all of the other skills. I don't know the right way to describe it scientifically, because it is an alternative and an RO. It's a DRAO because it's almost any other behavior that is an alternative to the ones that we're targeting.
Yeah.
But it's all, there's a whole lot of things we want them to do instead of engage in that way.
And I think that that all plays into this perspective change of
Yes.
people who look at SR and HRE as not quote unquote productive. It's we're going to start pioneering what data you can be collecting in
Yes.
those moments, what behavior you are actually shaping. There's just already hundreds of data points that are happening. We're just not doing a good job of capturing what's actually happening and measuring
and
the
we're
change
not,
that's
it's
happening.
because people don't think they're directly, because there's such a belief that we have to sit and directly teach someone for them to learn something.
Yep.
Like that I have to tell you to play with the toy in this way, and that's how you learn to play with the toy in this way. And we're missing the opportunities of just spontaneous, it's not spontaneous, I know you hate that word, but the learning, the generative learning that's occurring, right? Like we're in this contingency, we're in this context. No one is manipulating anything. The environment and you, with the addition of a person you trust, is teaching you skills, because I'm struggling to describe it. It's just some new thoughts I've been having, which is no one is asking you to perform new skills, but the opportunities to perform new skills are there, and they're reinforced, because then your repertoire expands and it's generative learning, right? Yeah. And so people aren't in our field, I don't think, are very good at teaching generative learning. Synthesized reinforcement is really good at teaching generative learning. We're just really bad at measuring it and capturing it and understanding it right now.
I was thinking about that when we were in an overlap yesterday, and you were sitting there imitating a client and playing with them, and I was thinking about there's probably a lot of skills that on an assessment, because the client can't respond to a vocal SD and perform, put the block on. Yeah. Whereas Hillary was working with a client yesterday that was imitating at least one or two actions every 30 seconds.
Novel.
That Hillary, and on an assessment, hey, if I were to do it in such a controlled context, we probably wouldn't see those skills. But just because I can't mark that on a specific assessment doesn't mean that the child doesn't have that skill.
Right.
And in that moment, it was about the way that we were working with the child and not the other way.
We talked about this yesterday. You're talking about a client that was like working on some
Literally the same case.
basic level imitation.
Clap your hands.
The client won't clap my hands when I clap my hands, and like they don't have imitation. No, it's like
the
they just don't want to do what you're telling them to do.
And we're
right?
capturing the wrong MO. The client
Yeah.
is carrying around the one toy they engage with. We take the one toy they engage with to prompt them to clap their hands when they're engaging with a toy already.
Yeah.
So what I did, which is just a shout out to like my favorite intervention ever, which is called reciprocal imitation training. I just played with the toy that she had and created novel new ways. She was engaging in a lot of stereotypy. We were rocking and we were playing with the toy. And I just came up with new and novel ways to play with the toy. And she imitated me almost 100% of the times with no prompting. I would just be like, whoosh, and make a fun sound effect and show her a new way to do something with the toy. And she would do it right away and was engaged and looking at me. And meanwhile, the technician, which, she was a great tech. She was so good with the client, wanted to teach her to clap her hands in a context where she was already playing with the toy we could do imitation with. And we don't have to do it. Who here has ever had someone come up to them and say, do this?
Yeah.
And I think like it's actually kind of sad because to me that shows that like current assessments and current tools are rooted in compliance and
They
not
are.
cooperation, right? Like an intervention that we're trying to do was rooted in cooperation, but because they couldn't do it the second I told them and the way I told them, and
With
I
the
had to be
specific
the one to
SD.
say it with the specific SD, like you have to write off that child doesn't have a skill.
No imitative repertoire.
Yeah.
Can we shift a bit?
Yeah.
I want to talk about the Dearborn transformation, and like the progress. I talked about today. Transformation is not a destination; it's a journey. And there's still a number of things that we want to improve upon, but there is a distinct difference when you walk through that center now versus when you walked through that center 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And you're a part of that. You're a big part of that. And I thought maybe we could talk through just like the journey through that.
Yeah.
And like first time you walked through it. First time you walked in the center.
How was it?
We
Derek?
offered you a job. You accepted a job. I don't think you walked through the center before.
You were the only you two were the only people I met at Centria up until I accepted the job.
Yeah.
I was in Michigan and planned a day to
On our
be
first
at
day.
Dearborn, his first day, to make sure he didn't quit
Yeah.
after walking through Dearborn.
I mean, I never realized how, you said it was like the biggest center, but I never realized how big of a center the Dearborn Center is. That one center was as big as the last provider I was at. And that provider had like 4 different buildings that all the kids were split up at. And so like this was all in like one house under one roof. Not only like what was happening on the floor, that in combination with like the aesthetics, like it was just like a big like culture shock. And I think that was like a pivotal moment in like talking to Hillary at the end of our first day there of like, do I really want to walk into like the prettiest center? Of course I do, because all of our clients deserve like the best clinical quality. But like in that moment, in terms of like, do I just want to walk into somewhere where I can't put my skills to use and there's not learning to be had? And I think like the conversation we had that evening was pivotal, and like let's roll up our sleeves and let's be here every morning.
Let's do this work together.
Let's try to do the work together. So that was like initial thoughts.
I was looking for good baseline data in any intervention.
Yeah.
Right? And you got some good baseline data. All right, so that's the initial thought. So like what's the journey through then? Like what were some of the struggles that you had, and like what are some of the successes that you've seen?
I think as much as like we at Centria have had like the top-down approach, which I think it's better than the grassroots movement. There's still like, you still can't overlook how much alignment there is across like different levels of like supervisors and technicians and clinical directors and vice presidents. And so I think like in the beginning, I myself was like, hey, it's top down, like everybody's bought in, good to go. Like, let me just try to do what we need to do. And
You're the final piece.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
You're just the cherry on top.
and
Yeah.
so like then we quickly learned that there still needs to be a lot of communication, a lot of alignment ongoing to like ensure this, even if it is a top down approach. And so I think I think one of the really big things that helped Dearborn in its success was that alignment across like a few different levels. Like of course, one like, area vice president, clinical directors, leads, clinicians, and then we really tried to use like BTSs or behavior technician specialists, like a support position, to like aid to the rollout, because we have such a large center, and if each of our clinicians focus is doing SBT with one client and writing foundational plans across our clients, like it would take even 2 or 3 leads a long time to actually like touch every client, in terms of like rolling out the foundational plan. So I think having like some sort of middle management was really pivotal in terms of like, hey, this person has a foundational plan. Let's train a group of people that can be really good at reading foundational plans and then being hands-on with them to like aid in our training and aid in our support of like, hey, if a behavior happens, like I know we have like 4 people that can go in and say, or know how to like remove the EO or undo the trigger. And so I think that type of alignment and having like a middle management position that could help facilitate that was really helpful, because then we also had people that came from the technician group that technicians trusted. And so like, because Dearborn is such a large center and because there's, so many clinicians and so many clients, I think it can be difficult to roll something out like Foundations of Care if you don't identify just as much additional support as you can. And so I think like the leaders in like for Michigan did a really good job with like allowing a group of technicians to be there that weren't necessarily always working with kids, or like, hey, if we have someone who cancels, if they have the skills for it, can we use them as support and to walk around or help us do, fidelity checks and different things like that. So when I think back to that, I really think about that strongly, and I think that will be helpful just across markets and across locations, not just for Foundations of Care, but for like
Anything.
things in general, and training and support that's needed in general. So I think that that took like 6-7 months to figure that out and to get that in place. And because of variability, we actually only had that in place for like 3 or 4 months after that, because of just staffing is difficult. There's variability in clients and in what people want to do. And so even despite that variability, I think it was good to have a few good months of like having that alignment and having all those different positions to like really hit hard on it.
One thing that I've really enjoyed seeing and hearing about around this transformation, we talked about with Miriam around, it's shifted a culture to be like more receptive to feedback and feedback from anybody. And I've heard that it's also allowed for, now that our technicians are fluent in the foundational plan, to be able to work with other clients.
Yeah.
Right. So like it's a more supportive environment, which is like evident when you walk through.
Much,
that place.
yeah.
Because I think from a technician's standpoint, it's like if you're never unsure of like all the supervisors in the building like can clinically agree on things, our values aligned, then like you might not know what type of feedback you're going to get from where. And so like
a good point.
with this process, like you kind of like also ensure that your clinicians are trained and they align with their values. So like I can trust any of my clinicians to like go and tell my client, like if they see something, related to behaviors, especially, like I can trust that feedback too.
There's
And
no more the like, well, my supervisor, and like, well, this tech told me
We
to
don't
do
write it that
this, and
way.
my
Yeah.
supervisor doesn't agree with that, and
Yeah.
like, you can't tell me what to do because this is how we do it with this client.
Yeah. And so, and then I think from a clinician standpoint, like there's more trust in like the community of clinicians you have around you, because you're implementing and you're practicing effective tools that, you're bought into and that you understand and that you've like been taught how to do with fidelity.
I could keep you here a long time.
I know. I've been waiting on a question that I wanted to ask.
Ask it.
It's way back, but it kind of relates. One of the things, and I think when I think about like people listening to us talking and the things we're talking about with the foundational plan, like I have learned a lot, and I don't want to share what I've learned right now. I want to ask from you, like, what have you seen in your experience across so many clinicians now and so many clients when a client is identified for tier 2 intervention, like in PFA, and someone's like, the client needs a PFA, and we now say, do you have a foundational plan? Have you implemented it to fidelity? What have you seen when that occurs in terms of, do they still need to do a PFA? What has that data been like for you anecdotally?
Yeah, anecdotally, I think like more times than not, we end up like saying like, oh, we don't need to go like rush into a PFA. Because I think everybody's initial concern is like, we have all these dangerous situations. We need to do an analysis and figure out and get the learner an SBT. But because synthesized reinforcement is like the main component in doing SBT, exposing a learner to that and enriching the environment, I think is like a big area of relief and help for the client and for the clinician. And so I think the ability of the foundational plan to do that then also eases like a clinician's nerves or a technician's nerves. And I think it aids in the perspective shift of like, you know, I've seen some technicians who like get uncomfortable when a client's in like an enriched environment for so long, because like their perspective of like being productive with the client isn't fully aligned with like everything you were just talking about of what's actually happening in synthesized reinforcement. And so knowing it can bring that sense of relief, knowing we don't have to do the PFA and SBT process with every client, and then knowing that it's bringing a perspective change, I think are like two of the greatest things that I've seen.
Yeah.
And knowing like productivity can be measured in a different way. And then also you don't have like the pressure. Like I would have supervisors in the past where I would have them come and observe in like my HRE context, and I'm like so proud of it, and my clinicians doing all of this interaction and the clients cooperating with so many things. And you know, at the end of my half-hour observation, you know, I get feedback of like, you know, I didn't see your technician run one trial, or I didn't see them, you know, collect these data points. And I'm, you know, I felt defeated in the moment.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, whatever. Like I know it was productive, and so I think that perspective change is healthy for our field and our community at large, and I think it's going to be really helpful for our clients.
One of the distinctions I think we should make about the foundational plan, though, is that it's not just about synthesized reinforcement, right? Like that's a place we can go. It's a place we can utilize. It's a helpful context, but the foundational plan has so much more to it, right? It should lay out for a technician, like when can you and should you present learning opportunities? What does that structure look like? What does the environment look like? How do you know when to push them, your client, and give them more challenging context? How do you know when to pull back? How do you set up the more challenging context, not just synthesized reinforcement, but how do you move into the more challenging context with your clients? I think that's a really important distinction too, that I finding is missed a little bit sometimes of like, yeah, we're doing a foundational plan and we have synthesized reinforcement. Well, what about the rest of it? I mean, the plan there's a lot to it. It's not just what's their HRE, what's their SR. It's what is their learning context and how do we set them up for success in their learning context?
Yeah, and I think a lot of those conversations have happened probably between technicians and clinicians, and like you like know it in your head or it's like across your supervision notes. But now that it comes from our values, and now it's like documented somewhere for someone to reference and then like read and learn and implement even more, like is a point of like confidence for your staff and for your employees. So like, especially for like substitute technicians.
Yes.
You know, I think about that a lot. And we use that to like coach our clinicians to write the plans of like, if you had like a staff here and you couldn't be here to tell them everything you wanted them to know, like what would you put across these different parts of the plan? And so like, you don't have to write off a substitute session as...
You don't know if you're going to get a Jerry
yeah.
or a Susie Q from Dairy Queen for your tech. You just don't know.
And you can be more confident that like your client's going to be safe, number one.
Yeah.
And that they're still going to have a productive session.
Yeah. One thing, just to wrap up, the thing I'm most overjoyed about and like continue to be excited about is how this process evolves and how we just continue to learn and continue to get better. You know, like when we started down this journey, it was like I was Oprah, and it was just like everyone's getting PFAs, right? Like just you get a PFA, everyone's getting a PFA. And like what we realized is like that's just
I already knew that when you hired me.
Yeah.
I want to say that for the record.
One thing I learned as a result of this was that like
not everybody needs
not everyone needs it, and it's not the most like effective use of time
Nope.
if they don't need it.
even though we can do it super efficiently.
For sure. But like this foundational plan is transformative across a variety of different ways. So it's like the transformation part is the thing that I'm excited about.
Yeah.
But then I'm also just like, every time I get to talk to people like you and other people like you, like there's a transformation of leaders that are happening within an organization. And leadership is such an important aspect of the work that we're doing. And you talked about it being contingency shaped, being out there leading. We can't do what we want to do without effective leaders who are willing to like lean in and lead. And like no one really embodies that more than you. And so, just really proud of you. Really
Me
excited
too.
that you're here, man. I'm really excited. This is the next step in your journey as an area director of clinical services, and I look forward to what's to come.
Me too.
Thank you.
I told Jerry I just feel so grateful to be able to be like say that I had any level of shaping in his process of becoming more moving up in his career. It's been a privilege.
You two are the number 1 and 2 reasons that I came to Centria.
Who's number
We'll
one?
talk about who's number one. All right.
I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Jerry.
Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you, guys.
And that concludes another episode of the HRE podcast.
Thanks for listening. If the HRE podcast is a part of your synthesized reinforcers, let us know what else would make the perfect reinforcement context for you in the comments below, and join us next time.